Welcome to Chapter 3, Language and Communication. The aim of this tutorial is to help you understand the relationships amongst language, communication, and critical thinking. So the learning outcomes for this section is you have to know what language is. There's a lot of definitions, so evaluating these definitions, understanding different communication styles, and the use of language to manipulate. So, as many of you were probably aware of the mass shooting, the largest mass shooting in Canadian history occurred, I want to say about a year ago in Nova Scotia, where someone went through 16 locations, burning down houses and shooting people. And there's been a lot of criticism since then that there's been some poor communication skills that really contributed to this. You know, there's a lot of controversy, or at least some controversy around this Amber Alert we have in Ontario when something happens, goes directly to our phones. And a lot of people said, you know, if you had communicated to the communities in this way, maybe some tragedy could have been prevented. So strong communication skills are very important, and sometimes it even means the difference between life and death. I would especially think this is important if you're entering the healthcare system, and being able to communicate with people effectively, efficiently, and accurately is super, super important. So good communication skills are an essential part of critical thinking. People who have effective communication skills often communicate openly, they're clear, they're accurate, they take care with the words that they use. They also have an awareness of their own language and others' languages, right? So if you're trying to communicate back and forth with people, maybe English is not their second language, you really understand how the language can be confusing and how it can be misleading, and there's an awareness of that. And then you're also open to how people communicate differently. People have a different communication style based on their preference, their upbringing, maybe their culture. So it's super important to really recognize that people operate with different communication styles. Language is simply a system of communication, right? With arbitrary symbols, and whether they're spoken or verbal. There's many languages all over the world that have different symbols. None of it's universal. All the verbal information sounds differently, and it's really just language is that system of being able to communicate information to other individuals. And by creating a shared reality among people, language is a primary means for transmitting cultural concepts and definitions or traditions. Absolutely, right? You know that in certain languages, there's words for things that we don't have in English, and a lot of that they use for transmitting culture and tradition. I'm sure the same is for English. There's words that we have in English that we use that may not be apparent in Japanese or in German or in other cultures and traditions. There are over 6,000 languages across the world, and here's a map of kind of the breakdown. You can see the lighter yellow is European influenced languages, and then so it's pretty diverse there, and then you can see the other languages broken down. I want to say the most popular language now is English, followed by maybe Chinese, Cantonese, or Mandarin, and then Spanish I think is 3. But here's a breakdown of some of the dominant languages in the world. And of course, there is, in all languages, there's nonverbal language, right? Like this guy saying, come forward. What's interesting is different cultures have different verbal languages too. So you might travel and, verbal communication you use here in Canada is going to be different in India, it's going to be different in Asia and Africa and maybe South America. So this is not universal, but every language probably has nonverbal communication as well. So language has one basic function, right? To communicate information to ourselves, about ourselves to the world. Other functions of the language are directive language, which is used to direct or influence action. Expressive language is used to communicate feelings. Emotional language is used to generate an emotional impact. And ceremonial language is used in prescribed formal circumstances. So there's different uses and functions of language depending on the situation and the circumstances. We talked about nonverbal, and of course, we can use our body to communicate things, but we can also use artwork and photographs and film to communicate and reinforce uh, language. Animals communicate. For a long time, people believed that maybe human beings were the only ones that were able to communicate, but we now know there's a vast amount of research that demonstrates that we are not the only species on Earth that can communicate. And obviously, language enables effective critical thinking. It can also create ambiguity and misunderstanding, right? So you have to make sure the language you use is clear and precise. In a good way to approach language is with curiosity and awareness that other people's languages may be a little bit different, and that opens up the possibility of misunderstandings and manipulation. So um, it's very important also to recognize that language can cause misunderstanding, and it can cause some ambiguity, which means situations that you're not entirely clear about. And you need to be open to that and aware of that. So this was a classic interview between Lance Armstrong and Oprah Winfrey when they're asking him about his steroid use, and a lot of people, saw the words coming out of his mouth, but then also were paying close attention to his body language, and that they felt that his body language was demonstrating he was not being entirely open. And I guess later on we learned that it was in fact true. He was doping and doing a bunch of things that he shouldn't have been and breaking rules. And that just shows you that there's a lot of information that's communicated non-verbally and can be accurate. We talked a little bit about language as a cultural construct, right? Good critical thinkers realize that word choices and nonverbal cues significantly influence how verbal communication is interpreted and misinterpreted, right? The following approaches greatly assist us in effectively communicating. So our language needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and you also have to be willing when you're listening to ask for clarification. If certain things are unclear, it's always important when you're listening to ask if you're not entirely sure what someone is saying. So there's two types of meanings here. We're going to cover donative is the first one, and that's like the dictionary definition of something, and connotative is the way meanings of a word or phrase can be influenced. Is not necessarily the definition of the word in the dictionary. A good example here is I was tutoring a Korean student when I was in university, and I explained to them that I went to Niagara Falls on the weekend, and it was very cool because the water kind of freezes over the rails, and parts of the fall freezes, and I thought it was just a really cool experience. So I said to him, yeah, it was really really fascinating and cool how the water had frozen all over the place. And he kind of looked at me in confusion. He said, um, you thought it was cool this weekend? I would imagine that it was cold." And I kind of chuckled and thought how confusing that must be, that I was using the word cool to describe something that I enjoyed, and he was looking up the definition in his book, and it said cool is a temperature, right? It's that cool is just before cold, and that the winter it's cold and it's not cool. So that's an example of how a connotative meaning, we can use words that mean something different in the dictionary to describe things that don't necessarily align with the dictionary definition. So stipulative definitions are definitions given to words, to new words or terms, and new definitions of existing words. So this is an example of how words can change in meaning. Lexical definition is the definition as we described earlier. The dictionary definitions and precising definitions are used to reduce vagueness. So there's two types: theoretical definitions and operational definitions, and those are used to make language more precise. And then there are persuasive definitions, and those are used to influence or persuade people. So body mass index is a good example of operational definition. This language is used very precisely to communicate if someone is underweight, overweight, healthy weight, or obese. And it is used strictly in the operation of communicating with someone whether their weight is at a healthy point or a healthy number based on their height. That's body mass index. Here are 5 definitions or 5 criteria for evaluating definitions. I'm going to let you go through those in more detail. I'm not going to read through every slide and every line because being on the receiving end of that, I know that it's not always engaging. You don't always learn well that way, so you can go through those on your own. Good critical thinkers are aware that there are differences in individuals as well as groups and how they communicate in styles, and they understand our styles and those of others to facilitate good communication in relationships and in critical thinking. It's very important to understand the way you communicate is not necessarily the same way that someone else will communicate, and that understanding this is critically important to being an effective communicator. There are 4 basic types of communication styles: assertive communicators, aggressive communicators, passive communicators, and passive aggressive communicators. So you can kind of see where you might fall into different communication styles, maybe based on who you're talking with and the situation, and that you may know people that are predominantly an assertive communicator or a passive communicator. International diplomacy and nonverbal communication. This goes into how important it is between cultures to communicate in ways that are very clear, because given international diplomacy and how important it is critical that people are communicating with people from other cultures in a clear and concise way, right? That there's not, because there's lots of opportunities for language and nonverbal communication to be very vague and ambiguous when communicating between cultures. And obviously language as manipulation, right? Like language can be used as a way to manipulate people using very emotional language, rhetorical devices, and deliberately deceiving people. So we have to be very aware that there's often people and organizations that are trying to manipulate the way we feel and what we think using language. So emotional language is used to elicit certain emotions. It's not always bad, but it can obviously be used to manipulate us in the way we think. And politicians are obviously notorious for using manipulative language of trying to twist things so they line up with their beliefs and kind of make them look good and the other person look bad. So there's lots of examples in politics of how people use manipulative language to influence people's thinking. Euphemisms replace negative terms with neutral ones or positive ones. Good example of this, sometimes you'll see instead of someone calling it a used car, and you go to a used car lot, they call it a previously owned car. It's a way to kind of make it seem like it's a positive thing that has been previously owned and not used. And Diaphonisms is the opposite. They're going to use a negative term to produce a negative result. They're going to twist something, right? So you might say, it's not a previously owned car, it's a used car. You should call it what it is. And that's a way to try to make the car look negative. Sarcasm, we all know what sarcasm is. Hyperbole is a device where we use to exaggerate or overstate or distort facts. There's lots of examples about how people might use language to exaggerate things and make them seem worse than they are. The news is a classic example of this. They're always trying to use headlines and news segments and exaggerate and overstate things, so then people are more engaged in what they're saying. But a good critical thinker, we must be able to recognize and resist these devices, these rhetorical devices. Facial expressions can disclose a wealth of information. Obviously, reading people's face is very important when it comes to communication, which makes it hard in the current environment with everyone wearing masks, right? We have to communicate through the eyes really and with our hands. It's hard to communicate with our whole face. Everyone knows what lies are and how they can, mislead people. And then here's just a couple ways of detecting lies. Making sure that your verbal cues line up with your nonverbal cues line up with what you're saying, right? And then sometimes blinking, changing your tone, pitch, storytelling can be a classic cue or classic cues for someone who's not telling the truth. Okay, conclusions here. Language is a form of symbolic communication that we covered in the first slide there. It's used to organize, express, and critically analyze experiences. It shapes our understanding and reality of ourselves. Good communication skills are vital in critical thinking. As good critical thinkers, we need to clarify and define terms, be mindful of communication styles and of ours and others, and be aware that some people are out there to manipulate and deceive us using language. Okay, that is a very brief overview of the material from chapter 3. If you have any questions about any of that information, please don't hesitate to send me an email, request a WebEx meeting, or jump into any of our live sessions to ask questions.